afternoon, students, and welcome to today's lecture on athletics and education in ancient Sparta. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we're journeying into the southern Peloponnese to look at the role that athletics played in the most militaristic of the ancient Greek city-states. Now, we've seen in our journey so far the role that sports have played in religion, in politics, and in civic pride. But today, we're going to look at the role they play in the education of youth, both for social and for militaristic purposes. Now, Sparta didn't become the most feared city-state with the most powerful army just by acting tough. They trained their children from a very young age to be physically and mentally dominant in a wide range of areas. And what's more, this training didn't just focus on the boys. The girls also participated, albeit in a slightly different manner. So whether you're looking to make your last stand at Thermopylae or just want the six-pack of King Leonidas, journey with me as we investigate Sparta and physical education. Alright, so you're probably familiar with Sparta from movies like The 300, where a few chiseled Spartan dudes fend off thousands of Persian invaders. In that battle, the battle known as the Battle of Thermopylae, was indeed one of the most memorable in all of Greek antiquity. But let's wind it back a little bit further to situate Sparta and see how this military machine rose to power. It all began in the Dark Ages, a period of time around 1000 BCE, when perhaps two small villages joined together in the southern Peloponnese, forming the city-state of Sparta. Now, the Peloponnese as a whole is a large peninsula that juts out from the southwestern mainland in Greece. So it's a pretty decent distance from Athens and from Thebes and from some of the other strong city-states of the classical period. And in Sparta's earliest days, it spent much of its time conquering surrounding regions in the Peloponnese, which helped it earn its reputation as a military power. But the exact development of Sparta in its earliest days can be somewhat difficult to pin down, in large part because we have very few writings from the Spartans themselves. We have a lot of outsider takes on how it came about, from Herodotus and Thucydides and Xenophon and Plutarch, but not really very much from their own Spartan perspective. What these later and frequently foreign authors do have to say, however, is that the main man who made Sparta, Sparta with capital S, was the early lawgiver Lycurgus. Now, to these historians, Lycurgus lived at the dawn of the Archaic period in Greece, maybe sometime around, 800 BCE. And it was Lycurgus who was responsible for establishing the cultural institutions that provided the rigid social structures and military organization that made Sparta so dominant. Politically, Lycurgus organizes Sparta into a dual monarchy, and that's kind of why we think that Sparta may have originated from joining two separate villages. And this monarchy is balanced out by the Gerousia, or the Council of Elders, who held equal sway to the executive branch of government with that dual monarchy. It was Lycurgus who created the Pelennors, or the iron weights, which the Spartans used as currency, foregoing things like silver and gold, which were used in other areas of Greece, because they thought that would make the men soft and overly focused on material possessions. Lycurgus also ensured strong social bonds amongst the Spartan men. To do this, he formed the Syssitia, or eating groups of 15 men each. And these groups became incredibly tight, and each person would have had to contribute food for the sustenance of the group as a whole. Spartan men in theory, then, were all perfectly equal. But their exploits, the exploits on the battlefield or in athletics, they could earn those individuals greater social standing among their Spartan peers. And finally, Lycurgus instituted the agoge, the training program for young Spartan boys that would turn them into hardened, fierce, powerful Spartan men. Now, Spartan training began at birth, when the elders of the Gerousia would examine each male baby boy. If the boy was strong and healthy, he was allowed to live. If the boy was weak or sick, he was left at the foot of Mount Taygetus, where he was exposed to the elements, with the idea that he would eventually die. Now, at the young age of 7, young Spartan boys were ripped away from their home, their family, and everything they knew in the world. No longer was his family. Rather, his group of other 7-year-old boys, well, that was his new family. And these boys were known as the Paides. Each one had his head shaved, and he was given only the most basic of implements, a simple red cloak and a sickle, the tool that Spartan slaves known as helots. And sidebar here, right? Like, helots weren't actually Spartans. They were the conquered neighbors known as Messenians, and they were collectively owned by the Spartan citizenry. So when we use helots, just think kind of Spartan slaves taken from another group. Anyway, those Spartan kids, right? They had their head shaved, they had their cloak, and they had their sickle. But that was about it. Anyway, the young children, they were given the tools of the helots. Now, with this simple tool, the boys were intentionally underfed, which meant that they had to learn to hunt or to scavenge or to steal food, all without being caught. Since if they were caught, they were whipped and beaten harshly. In addition, they had to make their beds out of reeds, ripped from the ground. And to survive, they had to rely on their own skills and each other, starting the bonds that would make them inseparable later in life. Now, in addition to these survival skills, the young boys also trained and competed in more traditional sports. Things you'd recognize, right? Like foot races, such as those at Olympia. Those were common. In combat sports like wrestling and boxing, those are natural fits for the militaristic Spartans. Now, one of the more unique Spartan sports was similar to the old childhood game, King of the Hill, where you'd have teams of boys placed on a small island, and their goal was to push the other team off the island by any means necessary. As Pausanias puts it, this includes pushing, kicking, biting, and gouging. Now, perhaps surprisingly, Spartan boys also participated in other less violent forms of training. They competed in dancing contests and musical contests, in addition to the traditional racing and combat sports and kind of unique Spartan events. Every 10 days during this time, the boys had to present themselves for inspection. If they passed, they were safe. If they were seen to be weak or unfit, they were beaten mercilessly. And as the boys reached their early teens, they also took on an older mentor who would help continue their physical and their mental education. There's still substantial debate as to whether these pederastic relationships were sexual in addition to educational, but it certainly wouldn't be unusual if that were the case. Now, as these boys grew into their late teens, their training progressed, and they continued their participation in all sorts of competitions. One such late-stage trial was to live off the land for an entire year. The teen would have to leave the polis, the city-state. He would have to forage for food. He would have to build his own shelter. And he'd have to live entirely off the land for that whole year. This would teach him an incredible level of self-sufficiency and resourcefulness. And finally, if all of these things were completed successfully, the youth was proclaimed a man, and he joined one of the Syssitia, or eating groups. He was now an equal to all other men, and served in the military for the next 10 years. Afterwards, he'd join the reserves and settle down with a family, and continue the Spartan training process as a teacher, rather than a student. Now, some of the most uniquely Spartan rituals were those associated with the cult of Artemis Orthea. And over here, you can see the scant remains of the temple of Artemis Orthea, adjacent to the ancient town of Sparta. Now, scholars think that Orthea was a local goddess, specific to the town of Sparta in its earliest days. But then as time went on, the cult center merged this goddess with the worship of the Pan-Hellenic goddess Artemis. Hence you get Artemis Orthea. You can see some of the early finds from the sanctuary over here. And you get small figurines of the goddess as well as some small animal figurines, suggesting that Orthea, just like Artemis, was also a goddess associated with animals and with hunting. Now, several of the ancient authors provide some insight into how the ritual worked. And it was similar to, or maybe part of the agoge, the ritual focused on the training of young Spartan boys. Now, according to the ancient Greek author Xenophon, who was writing in the 4th century, or the 300s BCE, Spartan boys had to run a gauntlet in order to steal a block of cheese that was sitting on the altar of Artemis. And this game was somewhat reminiscent of a very brutal version of Capture the Flag. So the boys were split into 2 teams, and you had one team trying to steal the cheese, and you had the other team trying to prevent that from happening. And they did that by whipping or flogging anyone on the opposing team. Now, the goal of this, assumedly, was to teach the young boys to endure high levels of pain, as well as to improve their stealth and their quickness. For me personally, I'm going to stick to purchasing my cheese at Trader Joe's. They got delicious cheeses, reasonable prices, little chance of being flogged. I will take that every single time. Now, the Greco-Roman author Pausanias, assumingly he wasn't going to Trader Joe's, but he was writing in the 2nd century CE, the 100s CE or AD. And he describes how that ritual evolved over time. So first and foremost, the ritual had become more performative. Eventually, there was actually theater-style seating that was erected around the sanctuary so spectators could watch the floggings happen. And now, rather than being whipped if you were caught, just all the boys were whipped, and it became a matter of who could withstand the most punishment. The priestess of Artemis would stand there with a wooden statue of the goddess near the altar where the boys were whipped. And if any boy was getting off too easy, either because they came from a prestigious family or because he was particularly good looking, whatever the reason may be, then the priestess would begin to lower the statue and claim that the goddess was calling for more and more blood. And this whole thing became an extremely bloody affair. And while the victors were praised and had their names inscribed on statues, some of the youths nearly died rather than quit the beatings. Cicero himself, the famous Roman orator, had heard tales of this, and he marveled at how the Spartans could be whipped without ever making a sound. Now, we can't leave the world of Spartan games without talking about one of the very few ball games from Greek antiquity. The Spartans were said to have played a game called Spyro Machia, very literally translated as battle ball. It's not completely certain how this game was actually played, but scholars have suggested that it was a violent take on a slightly better known game called Episkiros. The game itself involved 5 teams of 14 players each, and in a way, it somewhat resembles modern-day American football. At the start of each game, the ball was placed in the center of the field, and at a given signal, a horn or something like that, competitors would sprint to grab the ball. Now, according to some scholars, the game was simply a matter of keep away, doing whatever it takes to either maintain possession of the ball or to get the ball from the other team. Other scholars, however, see this as a more violent version of that game, Episkiros, and they think it had something to do with throwing the ball over the other team's head and pushing them back behind a white line, which might serve as something like a goal line. Kind of sounds like a deep pass in modern day football, something along those lines. And as you can see, right, our knowledge of the sport is really pretty rudimentary, and the archaeological record doesn't do much to help. You can see here we have a small number of depictions of some sort of ball game, right? But they don't paint a full enough picture to give us a sense for the rules or how that game was played. We just see that there was some sort of sport with a ball. Regardless, keep a couple things in mind. First, there were ball sports in the ancient Greek world, even if they never made it into the Olympics. And second, the Spartans, as they always do, took this ball game and turned it into an incredibly violent sport, better bring your pads if you're going to suit up for Spyro Machia. Now, one of the more unique aspects of Spartan physical education is that it included girls as well as boys. And if you look at the list of events from the Olympics, or from the Pan-Hellenic Games, or from the Pan-Athenaic Games, you're going to find a distinct lack of athletic events for girls or for women. But in Sparta, girls participated in this training process. It wasn't the agoge by any means, but they trained nonetheless. Now, before we get carried away with seeing this as some sort of very progressive feminism in Spartan athletics, it's important to keep in mind here that much of the training of Spartan girls was to prepare them for marriage and for childbirth and for motherhood. And our evidence is pretty shaky, once again because it's mainly outsiders commenting on the practice. The Athenians in particular seem to be amazed that Spartan girls and young women shared the track with young boys. And they also had their own set of foot races and their own set of wrestling matches. And authors comment on the series of dances and gymnastics, which would have been both performative and athletic. One in particular is known as the bibasis, and it involved girls jumping up in the air off of 2 feet and then kicking those feet back to touch their butt before landing on the ground. I'm almost certain that if I tried this, I would fall completely on my face. But anyway, these outside commentators, they seem kind of weirded out by the whole thing. And they also seem a little bit like excited, maybe sexually excited by it as well, right? This idea of girls competing with boys. So the Roman poet Propertius says that females practiced in the nude alongside men and participated in throwing the discus, in boxing, and participating in the pankration. While a still later writer comments on them wrestling nude, both with themselves and with men. Now, most scholars don't think that these things ever really happened, but rather that they're a product of outside writers getting carried away with the idea of what girls were doing with boys in this strange and unique city-state of Sparta. And while we don't know for certain, archaeological remains like this figurine suggest that females participated in a somewhat short skirt or a tunic, which would have had an exposed leg there. And that still would have been considered kind of pretty light or even scandalous clothing for that time outside of the city-state of Sparta. Now, debate continues as to whether we should see Spartan female athletics as progressive and liberating, or whether we should see them at the whim of a patriarchal society. Most scholars, they lean towards the latter, with athletics and dancing having helped promote fitness that would then be conducive to childbirth and child rearing. And the world of female sports in Sparta, we also see that coming to an end when they get married. So on the one hand, somewhat progressive. On the other hand, this is still being done to support traditional female tasks in the ancient Greek world. So as I thought about the past meets present segment for today's lecture, the obvious thing that came to mind was Spartan physical education in high schools around the country. After all, most states require at least one class of phys ed to graduate, and so I was thinking about how that course might compare to Spartan physical education. And well, let's just say that the comparison, it sounds better than it actually is. Now, what we're looking at here is one school's requirements for physical education across the grades. We've got things like playing team sports, learning lifetime fitness and athletic skills, getting a sense for cardio and muscular exertion, improving one's overall physical fitness. But at most places, this would be covered in maybe one course over the entire 4 years of high school. So good luck developing a lifetime interest in cardio when you spend 1 week learning to run a mile. Anyway, again, it's kind of interesting, at least to me, that the goals seem solid, but there just doesn't seem to be much education or execution behind them. Perhaps a better place to start looking for physical education is actually within modern military training, which seems like a little bit more in line with what's actually going on in ancient Sparta. So let's look at what the army does during its boot camp and see what it requires for boot campers. So those boot campers, aged 17 to 21, they've got to be able to do 35 push-ups and 45 sit-ups and run 2 miles in 16 minutes and 30 seconds. Right? And I think that's actually split up. So it's just do 35 push-ups, do 47 sit-ups, and run 2 miles in 16:30. Not do all 3 of those things in the 16:30. Now, if you want to be truly elite and join the Army Rangers, you have to complete 49 push-ups in 2 minutes, complete 59 sit-ups in 2 minutes, and run 2 miles in less than 15 minutes and 12 seconds. You've also got to be able to do 6 pull-ups and hike for 16 miles with a 65-pound pack in less than 5 hours and 20 minutes. So I'm a little interested to see what you think here. Are we training new Spartan soldiers here? My personal take, and of course this varies from person to person, is that, surprisingly to me, having not been in the Army, this seems pretty doable. I mean, with an hour of exercise a day, or something like that, I imagine a lot of people could accomplish these things over the course of a year if they train for it. Or at least some reasonable amount of time, without, dedicating something like 13 years of unending training in the agoge. All right, you have made it to the end of another episode. Now, in today's lecture, we've taken a look at the physical education program in Sparta, the ancient Greek city-state most renowned for its military prowess. And we've seen that the military prowess that Sparta has, well, it doesn't just come out of nowhere. Instead, it's rooted in a deep, longitudinal training program. For boys, this centers on the agoge, the multi-year training program where boys are yanked away from their families, stuck with their peers, and trained by the state. Along the way, they compete in a series of trials. They learn to fend for themselves, and they're frequently beaten and bloodied. But when, or I guess more accurately, if they graduate, they join their peers to assemble the most fearsome phalanx the Greek world has ever seen. So if you're looking to make some serious gains, or even just tone up a bit, make sure to take a few lessons from Spartan Physical Education.